He once called a tractor agricultural misery on wheels. He'd never driven a combine, never lost a harvest to rain. Yet British farmers who've spent decades despising posh outsiders now call him one of their own. Because he did something for British farming no politician managed in 30 years. Here are 12 reasons why every British farmer loves Jeremy Clarkson. Reason 1. He showed the world how hard farming actually is. For decades, British farming had a visibility problem. Not in the sense that people didn't know farms existed, of course they did, but the reality of what farming actually involves, the sheer physical and financial and emotional weight of it, was almost entirely invisible to the average person going about their life in a town or a city. People bought their bread, they picked up their milk, they grabbed a bag of potatoes without a second thought, and the extraordinary chain of effort that put those things on the shelf, completely invisible. Then along came Clarkson's farm, and suddenly millions of people were watching a man they already loved, a man they trusted to tell them the truth, even when the truth was uncomfortable, discovering for the first time just how brutal farming really is. They watched him lose crops to weather he couldn't control. They watched him battle soil that refused to cooperate. They watched him stare at a field of failed vegetables and try to work out how he was going to cover his costs. And they watched him do it all without flinching. Now, farmers had been living this reality for generations, but nobody had ever put it on television in a way that made the rest of Britain actually feel it. Clarkson did. He didn't dress it up. He didn't make it look romantic or picturesque. He showed the mud and loss and the paperwork and the heartbreak, and he did it with enough honesty that people couldn't look away. For British farmers, that was worth more than any government campaign or countryside charity appeal had ever managed. He made the nation see them. Reason 2, he took on the bureaucracy farmers have been fighting for years. Ask any British farmer what keeps them up at night and they won't say the weather first. They'll say the paperwork, the forms, the regulations, the inspections, the rules that seem to change every other year. Written by people who have never set foot in a field and have absolutely no idea what it actually takes to run one. British farming is one of the most regulated industries in the country, and for years, farmers have been quietly drowning in it, filling in forms, applying for grants that take months to arrive, navigating a system that often feels designed to make their lives harder rather than easier. Nobody was talking about it. Not really. Not in a way that reached beyond the farming community itself. Then Clarkson started talking about it, loudly, on television, in front of millions. He sat across from council officials and planning committees and government representatives, and he said, in plain English, with genuine frustration, exactly what farmers across Britain had been saying to each other for years, but could never get anyone to listen to. He called it absurd. He called it maddening. He pointed out, with the kind of bluntness that only Clarkson can get away with, that the people making the rules had no practical understanding of the consequences. And farmers watching at home, farmers who had spent years feeling like they were shouting into a void, finally felt heard. Because Clarkson wasn't just complaining, he was doing it on the biggest stage in British television, and people were paying attention. Reason 3, he made the public fall in love with British produce. There's a quiet crisis that British farmers have been watching unfold for years. British produce, genuinely properly British food, grown in British soil by British hands, has been losing ground. Supermarkets fill their shelves with cheaper imports. Consumers reach for whatever costs less without thinking about where it came from. And the farmers who have spent their lives growing food on this island have watched their market shrink year by year almost without anyone noticing. Clarkson noticed, and more importantly, he made his audience notice. When he started selling produce from Clarkson's farm, the vegetables, the honey, the candles, the preserves, he didn't just open a farm shop. He turned buying British into something people actually wanted to do. He made it feel like a statement, like a small act of loyalty to something worth preserving. His farm shop queues became famous. People drove for hours. They queued in the rain. They bought jars of honey and bags of potatoes and felt genuinely good about it because Clarkson had given them a reason to care about where their food came from. And that ripple effect went far beyond his own farm. Farmers across Britain reported renewed interest in local produce. Farm shops saw increased footfall. People started asking questions at markets that they'd never thought to ask before. Clarkson didn't just sell his own food. He reminded an entire nation that British farming produces something worth paying for, and that the people who grow it deserve to be supported. Reason 4. He spent his own money and lost it publicly. This one mattered more than it might seem. British farming is not a profitable business for most of the people doing it. The average British farm makes a very modest income, and in many years it makes a loss. Farmers carry that financial pressure quietly, because that's what you do when the land has been in your family for generations, and walking away isn't really an option. What they don't often get is solidarity, especially not from wealthy public figures. Clarkson didn't just talk about farming being hard, he put his own money in, watched it disappear, and told everyone about it. He was transparent about the losses in a way that was almost shocking for someone of his profile. He didn't hide behind a successful bottom line. He showed the spreadsheets, metaphorically speaking, and admitted openly that the farm was costing him far more than it was making. And he kept going anyway. For farmers watching, that meant something real because it confirmed what they already knew. That you don't farm because it makes financial sense. You farm because it gets into your blood, and you can't imagine doing anything else. Clarkson understood that. Not because someone told him, because he lived it. He lost money on the farm and came back the next season. And in doing that, he demonstrated a kind of respect for what farmers do that no amount of sympathetic television presenting could ever have achieved. He didn't just observe the struggle, he shared it. Reason 5. He gave farming a voice in the national conversation. British farming has a lobbying problem. It's not that farmers don't have opinions. They have plenty. It's that those opinions rarely make it into the conversations that shape policy, public perception, and the future of the industry. The National Farmers Union does important work, but it operates in the background, in meeting rooms and government corridors, largely invisible to the general public. And the general public, by and large, doesn't think about farming policy until something goes wrong. A food shortage, a price spike, a disease outbreak. Clarkson changed the dynamic. Because when Clarkson talks about farming, people listen. Not because he's a farming expert, he'd be the first to admit he isn't, but because he's Jeremy Clarkson, and he has a platform that reaches into living rooms across the country. When he raised concerns about the impact of government policy on small farms, it became a news story. When he spoke about the pressures facing British agriculture, it trended online. When he turned up to a farming protest, cameras followed. He became, almost by accident, the most effective spokesperson British farming had seen in a generation. Not because he replaced the people who actually know the industry inside out, but because he amplified their voices in a way that the industry alone never could. He put farming on the front page. And for an industry that had spent years feeling ignored, that was genuinely significant. Reason 6. He championed the small farm against the big players. One of the quieter stories in British agriculture is the slow disappearance of the small farm. Large agricultural businesses have been consolidating land for decades. Small family-run farms, the kind that have existed in the British countryside for generations, are under constant pressure. They can't always compete on price. They can't always access the same grants or subsidies. And they often lack the resources to adapt quickly to changing regulations or market conditions. It's a slow erosion, and it happens largely without public comment. Clarkson's farm put a face on it. His farm, Diddley Squat, is not a large operation. It's the kind of farm that in the real world would be quietly struggling without anyone outside the local community knowing or caring, and the show made that struggle visible. It showed what it looks like when a small farm tries to diversify. The planning rejections, the market limitations, the sheer difficulty of making the numbers work when you're not operating at scale. And it showed Clarkson fighting for it anyway, refusing to give up, finding creative ways to keep the thing alive. For the thousands of small farm families across Britain watching that, it felt personal. Because it was their story, told by someone with enough profile to make the rest of the country pay attention. He didn't just sympathize with the small farmer. He became one. And he made sure everyone knew what that actually meant. Reason 7. He highlighted the mental health crisis in farming. This is the one that farmers talk about in quieter moments. Farming has one of the highest rates of suicide and mental health crisis of any profession in Britain. The isolation, the financial pressure, The unpredictability of the work, the weight of responsibility for land and animals and livelihoods. It takes a toll that the industry has historically been very reluctant to discuss openly. There's a culture of getting on with it, of not complaining, of being stoic in the face of difficulty because that's what the job demands. And that's what your father did, and his father before him. Clarkson's farm didn't shy away from the emotional reality of farming. It showed the frustration, the exhaustion, the moments where things go wrong, and there's nothing you can do about it. The weight of caring deeply about something that the around you seems indifferent to. And by showing those moments, by letting them exist on screen without wrapping them up neatly, the show gave permission for a conversation that the farming community desperately needed. Farmers watching recognized those feelings, and seeing them reflected back on a mainstream television program watched by millions made them feel less alone. It also introduced those feelings to an audience that had never considered them before. And in doing so, it built a kind of empathy for farming that no awareness campaign had ever quite managed to create. Reason 8. He made agricultural machinery exciting to the general public. Now, this one might sound lighter than the others, but don't underestimate it. Farmers love their machinery. There's a deep, genuine pride in the equipment, the tractors, the combines, the specialist kit that makes the work possible. It's not just practical, it's part of the identity of farming. The machinery is part of the culture. And for years, that enthusiasm existed in a bubble. Farmers talked about it with other farmers. Agricultural shows drew the faithful. But to the outside world, a tractor was just a tractor, something that slowed you down on a country road. Clarkson changed that. Because Clarkson is, at his core, a man who gets genuinely excited about machines. And when he got behind the wheel of a Lamborghini tractor, yes, Lamborghini make tractors, and yes, Clarkson made sure everyone knew about it, he brought that same energy he'd always applied to supercars. He made agricultural machinery interesting to people who had never given it a second thought. He talked about horsepower and engineering, and the sheer capability of modern farm equipment with the same enthusiasm he'd always brought to the automotive world. And farmers who had always known their machines were extraordinary finally got to watch the rest of the country catch up. It sounds small, but pride matters. And Clarkson gave farmers something to feel proud about in a way that reached beyond their own community. Reason 9. He exposed the supermarket pricing problem. Here is a number that British farmers know by heart, and that most British consumers have never thought about. The price a farmer receives for their product, whether that's milk, wheat, beef, or vegetables, is often a fraction of what that product sells for on a supermarket shelf. Sometimes a very small fraction indeed. The gap between what the farmer earns and what the consumer pays has been a source of deep frustration in the agricultural community for years. Farmers feel squeezed from both ends, by the rising cost of inputs like fuel and fertilizer, and by the downward pressure on prices from supermarkets that have enormous buying power and very little obligation to share the margin. It's a structural problem, and it's one that the industry has struggled to communicate to the public in a way that generates genuine outrage rather than a vague sense of sympathy. Clarkson talked about it directly in terms that his audience could understand and feel. He made the connection between the price on the shelf and the reality in the field. And he made it feel unfair because it is unfair. And when Clarkson tells millions of viewers that something is unfair, some of those viewers start asking questions. They start reading labels. They start thinking about where their food comes from and what the person who grew it actually got paid. That shift in awareness is exactly what British farmers have been hoping for. Reason 10. He brought young people to an interest in the land. British farming has an age problem. The average age of a British farmer is well over 50. Young people, by and large, are not going into agriculture. The industry is struggling to attract the next generation, and without that next generation, the long-term future of British farming looks uncertain. There are many reasons for this. Farming is hard, the financial returns are modest, and the culture around it doesn't always feel accessible to young people who didn't grow up on the land. Clarkson's farm reached a young audience, not just the traditional farming demographic, but teenagers and 20-somethings who watched the show and came away with a genuine curiosity about where food comes from, how land works, and what it actually means to grow something. Social media lit up with young people talking about the show, about Kaleb Cooper, the young farmer who became one of its breakout stars, and about the world he represented. Kaleb in particular became a figure that young people connected with. He was young, he was funny, he was passionate about farming, and he made it look like something worth caring about. Clarkson gave him that platform, and in doing so, he helped plant a seed, perhaps literally, in a generation that farming desperately needs to reach. Reason 11. He proved that farming is worth fighting for. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that sets in when you've been fighting for something for a long time, and nobody seems to be listening. British farmers know that exhaustion well. They fought for fair prices. They fought against regulations that don't reflect the reality of their work. They fought to keep their land, their businesses, their way of life, often quietly, often without support, often without any sense that the wider world cares whether they succeed or fail. Clarkson cared, and he showed it. Not in a sentimental way, not with a charity appeal or a campaign, but by actually doing the work, by getting his hands dirty, by refusing to give up when things went wrong, by coming back season after season, and continuing to fight for a farm that by any rational financial calculation wasn't worth the trouble. That stubbornness resonated deeply with farmers, because stubbornness is what farming requires. It's what keeps people going through bad harvests and falling prices and planning rejections and all the rest of it. Clarkson modeled something that farmers already knew but rarely saw reflected back at them, that the fight is worth having, that the land is worth fighting for, and that sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply refuse to quit. Reason 12. He made Britain care about its farmers again. And this perhaps is the one that matters most because everything else on this list, the bureaucracy, the pricing, the mental health, the machinery, the small farms, the young people, all of it depends on one thing: public support. Farmers cannot fix the structural problems in British agriculture alone. They need consumers who care. They need politicians who feel pressure from constituents who care. They need a media that reflects the importance of farming because its audience cares. For a long time, that care was missing. Not out of malice, just out of distance. Most people in Britain live in towns and cities, far from the land, with no direct connection to the people who grow their food. Clarkson closed that distance. He took millions of people who had never thought seriously about farming and gave them a reason to think about it. He made them laugh, and then he made them feel something real. He introduced them to a world they didn't know through a person they already trusted. And when the series ended each season, those viewers carried something with them. A new awareness, a new respect, a new habit of thinking even briefly about where their food comes from and who put it there. That is what Jeremy Clarkson gave to British farming. Not a solution, but something rarer and in some ways more valuable. He gave it an audience that finally cared. Jeremy Clarkson arrived in farming as an outsider. He made every mistake in the book. He lost money, argued with officials, and baffled his neighbors. But somewhere along the way, something shifted. The man who built his career on speed and noise discovered something slower, quieter, and far more important. And he brought the rest of Britain along with him. British farmers didn't need a celebrity to validate them. But they got something better. They got a witness. Someone who saw what they do, felt the weight of it, and told the truth about it to anyone who would listen. And millions did. If this brought back any memories of the British countryside, or if you've got a favorite Clarkson farming moment, let us know in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. He once called a tractor agricultural misery on wheels. He'd never driven a car. Here's the question for the comments. Which of these 12 reasons do you think farmers themselves would rank number 1? The pricing exposure or the mental health conversation? Drop your answer below. UK, US, Australia, Ireland, wherever you're watching from. And subscribe if you want to be there for the follow-up.